Mother Bear brought back. Lost kid to home. After 15 years, what happened next was shocking. Let us know where you're watching from. If you love my content, consider supporting it with a super thanks. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe. It'll help us to remain in touch with amazing people like you. The small village of Pinewood sat at the edge of a vast, ancient forest that locals called the Whispering Woods. Rain pattered against the windows of a weathered cabin where Clara and Mason Reed lived. They sat by the fireplace, staring at the flames, the silence between them heavy with 15 years of grief. Their daughter Willow had disappeared when she was just 2 years old, wandering into the forest while they were picking berries. The search parties found nothing. Not a footprint, not a scrap of clothing, nothing. Clara clutched a small wooden bird in her hands, the last toy Mason had carved for their daughter. Her fingers traced the worn edges, smoothed by years of desperate hope. "Do you ever feel like she's still out there?" she whispered, her voice barely audible over the crackling fire. Mason didn't answer. He never did when she asked that question. He had given up hope years ago, but couldn't bear to take that small comfort from his wife. Outside, the wind howled through the trees, carrying whispers of secrets hidden deep in the forest. Unknown to the grieving parents, eyes watched their cabin from the tree line. A massive mother bear stood there, her dark fur glistening with raindrops. Beside her was a figure draped in animal skins, tall but hunched, moving with the silent grace of a wild creature. The figure tilted their head, studying the golden light spilling from the cabin windows. Memories stirred, faint and distant like half-forgotten dreams. The mother bear nudged the figure gently, her warm breath fogging in the cold air. Years ago, she had found a small crying child near the river, abandoned and afraid, not unlike her own lost cubs. Something had stirred in her then, an understanding that transcended the boundaries between human and animal. The village had changed little over the years. The same small houses dotted the edge of the forest. The same smoke curled from chimneys. The same fear of the woods kept people close to home after dark. But everything was about to change. As dawn broke over the mountains, casting long shadows through the trees, the mother bear and her human companion emerged from the forest. The figure stumbled slightly on the unfamiliar open ground, eyes wide and wary beneath a tangle of wild, dark hair. Village dogs began to bark frantically. Doors opened. People stared in disbelief. "Bear!" someone shouted, and chaos erupted. Men grabbed rifles, women pulled children behind closed doors. But Clara Reed stepped out onto her porch, drawn by some unexplainable feeling. Mason followed, hand on her shoulder, trying to pull her back. The bear stopped at the edge of the village, her massive head turning toward the Reed cabin. The wild figure beside her hesitated, then took a tentative step forward. Clara's hand flew to her mouth, a strangled sound escaping her throat. "Willow," she whispered, the name she had screamed into the forest countless times over 15 years. The name etched on an empty grave in the village cemetery. The figure tilted their head, something flickering in their eyes at the sound of the name. The mother bear made a low rumbling sound, nudging the human forward with surprising gentleness. Then she sat back on her haunches, watching, waiting. "It can't be," Mason breathed, his face pale with shock. But Clara was already moving, stumbling down the porch steps, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might burst from her chest. The villagers watched in stunned silence as Clara approached the wild figure. Time seemed to stop as they stood face to face. A mother who had never stopped hoping, and a child who had grown up in the embrace of the forest. "Willow?" Clara whispered again, reaching out a trembling hand. The figure flinched back, eyes darting to the mother bear for reassurance. Then, slowly, they reached into their animal skin clothing and pulled out something small and wooden. A tiny carved bird, worn smooth by years of handling. Clara's legs gave way beneath her as she fell to her knees in the mud. "My girl," she sobbed. "My beautiful girl." The figure, Willow, trembled visibly, her eyes darting from Clara to the armed villagers and back to the mother bear. Her breathing quickened, and she took a half-step backward, clutching the wooden bird tightly. The bear let out a low, protective growl that sent ripples of fear through the watching crowd. "Put down your weapons," Mason shouted, his voice breaking as he stumbled forward to join his wife. "Can't you see? It's Willow. It's our daughter." Slowly, reluctantly, the villagers lowered their rifles, though their faces remained tight with fear and disbelief. Sheriff Thomas Fletcher stepped forward, his weathered face creased with concern. "Mason, Clara," he said gently, "I know how much you've wanted to find her, but you need to be careful. That's a wild animal, and whoever this person is, they've been living with it for God knows how long." Clara didn't seem to hear him. She remained on her knees, tears streaming down her face as she gazed at the young woman before her. Willow was tall and lean, her body hardened by years in the wilderness. Her skin was tanned and weathered, marked with small scars. Her dark hair hung past her waist in tangled mats. But her eyes, those were Clara's eyes, wide and green, now filled with a mixture of fear and curiosity. "She has Clara's birthmark," Mason whispered hoarsely, pointing to a crescent-shaped mark just visible on Willow's neck beneath the animal skins. "And look, the bird I carved for her second birthday." The village doctor, Eleanor Wright, stepped forward cautiously. "I remember that birthmark," she said quietly. "I delivered her." A murmur ran through the crowd. Could it really be possible? The lost Reed child returned after 15 years in the wild, and with a bear, of all creatures? "How do we know the bear won't attack?" someone called out. As if understanding the question, the mother bear sat down heavily, maintaining her watchful position but making no move toward the villagers. Willow turned to look at the bear, and then, to everyone's astonishment, she made a series of soft, grunting sounds. The bear responded with a low rumble. "She's talking to it," Sheriff Fletcher said, his hand still hovering near his holstered gun. Willow turned back to face Clara and Mason. She opened her mouth, tried to speak, but only strange, guttural sounds emerged. She frowned, frustrated, then tried again. "Willow," she finally managed, the name clearly unfamiliar on her tongue. She pointed to herself, then to the wooden bird, then to Clara and Mason. Clara sobbed harder, reaching out but not touching her, afraid to frighten her away. "Yes," she said through her tears. "You're Willow. Our Willow." Mason knelt beside his wife, his own eyes brimming with tears. "I carved that bird," he said softly, "just before you disappeared." Willow's eyes widened at the sound of his voice. Something like recognition flickered across her face. Slowly, hesitantly, she extended her hand, her fingers just barely brushing against Clara's outstretched palm. The touch, light as a feather, sent a visible shudder through Willow. She jerked back suddenly, making those strange grunting sounds again. The mother bear rose to her feet, responding with a series of huffs and growls. "She's scared," Eleanor said quietly. "This must be overwhelming for her." "What do we do?" Clara asked desperately, not taking her eyes off her daughter. "I can't lose her again." Mason stood slowly, careful to make no sudden movements. "We need to give her time," he said, though it clearly pained him to say it. She's been with the bear for 15 years. This is all strange to her." As they spoke, dark clouds gathered overhead. A rumble of thunder sounded in the distance, and Willow's head snapped up, her eyes darting to the sky. She made an urgent sound to the bear, who seemed to understand. The massive animal grunted in response, then turned toward the forest. "No!" Clara cried out. "Don't go!" But Willow was already backing away, her eyes fixed on the gathering storm. She held up the wooden bird once more, pressed it to her heart, then tucked it safely away. Another crash of thunder, and she flinched violently. Sheriff Fletcher stepped forward. "The storm's coming in fast. Everyone get back to your homes." "We can't just let her leave," Mason protested. Eleanor put a hand on his shoulder. "The bear is clearly protective of her. If we try to force her to stay, it might not end well for anyone." Clara rose shakily to her feet. "Willow," she called desperately, "please, stay. You can bring your bear friend. Just don't disappear again." For a moment, it seemed Willow might step forward again, but as the first heavy raindrops began to fall, she turned and loped swiftly toward the forest edge, the mother bear at her side. Just before they disappeared into the trees, Willow paused, looking back over her shoulder at the parents she had forgotten and the village she had never known. "She'll come back," Clara whispered, clutching Mason's arm as the rain soaked through their clothes. "She remembered the bird. She'll remember us, too." Mason nodded, unable to speak past the lump in his throat. After 15 years of believing their daughter dead, they had seen her alive, grown into a young woman, wild but alive. And the wooden bird, she had kept it all this time. As the villagers dispersed to escape the worsening storm, rumors and whispers already spreading like wildfire, Clara and Mason remained standing in the rain, staring at the place where their daughter had disappeared once more into the whispering woods. The storm raged through the night, wind howling around the reed cabin and rain lashing against the windows. Clara sat by the window, a blanket wrapped around her shoulders, her eyes never leaving the tree line. Mason busied himself building up the fire, preparing food, doing anything to keep his hands occupied while his mind raced. "What if she doesn't come back?" Clara asked, her voice small and frightened. Mason paused, a log in his hands. "She will," he said, with more conviction than he felt. "But Clara, she's not the little girl we lost. She's something else now." Clara turned to look at him, her eyes red-rimmed but fierce. "She's our daughter, no matter what." A knock at the door startled them both. Mason dropped the log and hurried to answer it, hoping against hope that somehow Willow had returned. Instead, he found Sheriff Fletcher and Eleanor Wright standing on the porch, rain dripping from their coats. "May we come in?" the sheriff asked. "We need to talk." Clara was immediately on her feet. "Is it Willow? Have you seen her?" Eleanor shook her head as they stepped inside. "No, but that's what we need to discuss." As Mason closed the door behind them, he noticed several other villagers gathered on the muddy road outside, watching the cabin with undisguised curiosity. News traveled fast in Pinewood. "Word has spread," Sheriff Fletcher said, removing his rain-soaked hat. "Everyone's talking about the wild girl and her bear." "Some people are frightened," Eleanor added gently. "Bear attacks have happened before, and they're worried about Willow's condition." "What condition?" Clara demanded. "She's been surviving in the wilderness for 15 years. Of course, she's different." Mason gestured for everyone to sit down. "What exactly are people saying, Tom?" he asked the sheriff, using his first name as they had known each other since childhood. Sheriff Fletcher sighed heavily. "Some think we should organize a hunting party to kill the bear, before it attacks someone. Others think Willow might be dangerous too, that she's forgotten what it means to be human. "That's ridiculous," Clara exclaimed. "Did you see her?" She recognized the bird Mason carved. She tried to say her name. "I know," Eleanor said soothingly. "And I believe it's her too. But Clara, Mason, you need to prepare yourselves. If Willow does come back, she's going to need serious help adjusting. She may not remember how to speak properly, how to live in a house, how to be around people. And that bear—" She trailed off, clearly uncomfortable. "What about the bear?" Mason asked quietly. Sheriff Fletcher looked him straight in the eye. "It can't stay here, Mason. It's a wild animal. Sooner or later, it will be a threat." "It's protected her for 15 years, Clara said fiercely. "That bear is the reason our daughter is alive." Before anyone could respond, a commotion outside drew their attention. Shouts and the sounds of running feet made them all turn toward the window. Mason rushed to the door and flung it open. In the gray dawn light, villagers were pointing toward the forest edge. There, barely visible through the misty rain, stood Willow and the mother bear. But something was wrong. The bear was swaying on her feet, and even from a distance Mason could see a dark stain on her thick fur. Willow was supporting the massive animal, her face contorted with distress. As he watched, the bear collapsed heavily to the ground. "She's hurt!" Mason shouted, already running out into the rain. Clara was right behind him, with Eleanor and the sheriff following. As they approached, Willow crouched protectively over the bear, making threatening gestures at the gathering villagers. Her eyes were wild with panic. "Stay back!" Mason called to the crowd. "Give them space." Eleanor moved forward cautiously. "I'm a doctor," she said softly, though she knew Willow couldn't understand. "Let me help." Willow bared her teeth, making a series of sharp, aggressive sounds, but the bear was breathing heavily, her massive sides heaving with effort. Blood seeped from a deep wound in her flank. "She's been shot," Eleanor said, her voice tight with anger. "Recently." Sheriff Fletcher's face darkened as he surveyed the crowd. "Who did this?" he demanded. No one spoke, but eyes shifted toward Silas Mercer, a hunter known for his quick temper and quicker trigger finger. The sheriff saw it too and turned toward him. "Silas, did you shoot this bear?" The man jutted his chin defiantly. "It's a bear, Tom. It was coming back toward the village. What was I supposed to do?" "It wasn't attacking anyone," Clara cried. "It was bringing our daughter back." Willow seemed to sense the rising tension. She positioned herself between the bear and the villagers, her movements fluid and dangerous, like a predator ready to pounce. A low, rumbling sound rose from her throat, an almost perfect imitation of the bear's warning growl. Eleanor knelt in the mud, maintaining a careful distance. "The wound looks deep, but if we can stop the bleeding, she might have a chance. Mason, I need clean cloths, hot water, my medical bag." "You're going to treat a bear?" Silas scoffed. "I'm going to treat the animal that kept Willow alive," Eleanor replied firmly. "And if anyone has a problem with that, they can answer to me." Mason rushed back to the cabin for supplies. As he gathered clean linens and put water on to boil, his mind raced. What would happen if the bear died? Would Willow stay? Would she run back to the forest alone? How could they possibly bridge the 15-year gap that separated them? When he returned with the supplies, he found Clara sitting on the wet ground, speaking softly to Willow, who remained crouched beside the bear but was watching her mother with wary attention. "Remember the songs I used to sing to you?" Clara was saying, her voice gentle. "Remember how you loved the one about the little bird who flew over the mountain? You would flap your arms and chirp." Willow's fierce expression had softened slightly, though she still kept one hand protectively on the bear's massive head. Eleanor worked quickly, cleaning the wound and packing it with herbs from her bag. "The bullet went clean through," she reported. "That's good, but she's lost a lot of blood, and infection is a risk." "Will she live?" Mason asked quietly. Eleanor glanced up at him, then at Willow, who was watching her every move with intense focus. "I don't know, but we'll do everything we can." Sheriff Fletcher had taken Silas aside and was speaking to him in low, angry tones. The other villagers stood in small clusters, whispering among themselves as they watched the strange scene unfold. A doctor treating a wounded bear, while a wild young woman and her parents huddled nearby in the rain. "We need to move her somewhere dry," Eleanor said, sitting back on her heels. "The old barn by your cabin might work, Mason." "It's empty since you sold the livestock, right?" Mason nodded. "But how do we move a bear that size?" The question was answered unexpectedly. Willow stood up suddenly and made a series of sharp sounds toward the forest. For a long moment nothing happened. Then, to everyone's amazement, 2 more bears emerged from the trees, younger than the mother bear, but still formidable. Gasps and cries of fear rose from the watching villagers. Some turned to run, while others reached for weapons. "Don't!" Clara shouted. "They're coming to help!" And indeed, the 2 younger bears approached the fallen mother bear, sniffing at her wound and making soft, distressed sounds. Willow made more of those strange, guttural noises, seeming to communicate with them. Then, with a coordination that stunned the watching humans, the 3 of them positioned themselves around the mother bear, ready to move her. "They're her cubs," Mason realized aloud. Grown now, but still her cubs. "This just gets stranger by the minute," Sheriff Fletcher muttered, but he ordered everyone to clear a path to the old barn. What followed was a sight the village of Pinewood would never forget. 2 young bears and a wild young woman carrying a wounded mother bear through the center of town, followed by the village doctor, the sheriff, and the parents whose child had returned from the dead. The procession moved slowly toward the old barn beside the Reed cabin, while villagers watched from windows and doorways too astonished to speak. Once inside the barn, fresh straw was quickly laid down, and the mother bear was gently lowered onto it. The 2 younger bears positioned themselves protectively nearby, while Willow crouched at the mother bear's head, stroking her fur and making soft, soothing sounds. Eleanor continued her treatment, showing remarkable calm in the presence of 3 wild bears. "She needs time to heal," she said at last, "and she needs to stay warm and dry." Mason brought blankets from the house, offering them to Willow, who took them with cautious hands. She carefully covered the mother bear, tucking the blankets around her massive form with a tenderness that brought tears to Clara's eyes. "What happens now?" Sheriff Fletcher asked quietly. No one had an answer for him. The situation was unprecedented. A girl raised by bears, returned to human society but still deeply bonded to her wild family. A wounded mother bear and her 2 grown cubs now sheltering in a village that feared and hunted their kind. Parents desperate to reconnect with a daughter who barely remembered how to be human. As the day wore on, most of the villagers returned to their homes, though many kept anxious watch from their windows. Clara and Mason brought food and water to the barn, offering some to Willow, who sniffed it cautiously before taking small bites. Eleanor checked on the mother bear regularly, each time approaching with slow, respectful movements that seemed to reassure Willow and the younger bears. By nightfall, the bear's breathing had steadied, though she remained unconscious. "The next few days will be critical," Eleanor told Mason and Clara as they stood just outside the barn door. "If infection sets in, there's little more I can do. And if the bear dies?" Mason asked the question they had all been avoiding. Eleanor looked back at Willow, who sat vigilantly beside the mother bear, occasionally making soft sounds to the two younger bears. "Then we may lose Willow, too," she said softly. "The bond between them is unlike anything I've ever seen." Clara's face was set with determination. "Then the bear can't die," she said simply. "We'll do whatever it takes." As darkness fell, Mason brought out lanterns to light the barn. He offered one to Willow, showing her how it worked. Her eyes widened with fascination as the flame cast dancing shadows on the walls. For a brief moment, she looked like any young woman encountering something new and wondrous. Clara and Mason settled in for the night, refusing to leave the barn despite Eleanor's insistence that they needed rest. They sat against the wall, watching their daughter, trying to reconcile the toddler they had lost with the wild young woman before them. "Tomorrow," Clara whispered to Mason, "we'll try to teach her to speak again, to help her remember." Mason nodded, squeezing her hand. "One step at a time," he agreed. Across the barn, Willow's head turned at the sound of their voices. She watched them for a long moment, her expression unreadable in the dim light. Then, slowly, she reached into her animal skin clothing and pulled out the wooden bird once more. She held it up, tilting it so the lantern light caught its carved wings and smooth beak. Clara held her breath, afraid to move, afraid to break the moment. Beside her, Mason was equally still. Willow looked from the bird to them and back again. Then, hesitantly, she opened her mouth and struggled to form a single word. "Father." The sound hung in the air between them, a fragile bridge across 15 years of separation. Clara's fingers dug into Mason's arm, her heart pounding. Willow frowned with concentration and tried again. "Father," she repeated, pointing the bird at Mason. Then she turned it toward Clara. "Mo there." It was a question, uncertain but hopeful. Clara nodded, tears streaming down her face. "Yes," she whispered. "Mother." "I'm your mother." Willow's expression softened almost imperceptibly. She clutched the bird to her chest once more, then returned to her vigilant watch over the mother bear. But something had changed. A door had opened, if only a crack. Outside, the rain finally stopped, and the clouds parted to reveal a sky full of stars. In the village, lights went out one by one as people went to bed, their minds full of the day's incredible events. And in the old barn beside the reed cabin, a family, fractured by tragedy, began the long, uncertain process of healing, watched over by 3 bears from the whispering woods. Dawn broke over Pinewood with a gentle golden light. Mason awoke with a start, momentarily confused by the scratchy straw beneath him and the earthy smell of the barn. Beside him, Clara slept fitfully, her face lined with exhaustion. Then he remembered Willow, the bears, the impossible miracle that had upended their lives in less than a day. He looked across the barn and froze. Willow was gone. His heart racing, Mason scanned the dim interior. The mother bear still lay on her bed of straw, her breathing labored but steady. The 2 younger bears dozed nearby, but Willow was nowhere to be seen. "Clara," he whispered urgently, shaking his wife awake. "Clara, Willow's gone." Clara sat up instantly, her eyes wide with panic. "No," she breathed. "No, not again." They scrambled to their feet, rushing to the barn door. Outside, the village was just beginning to stir, smoke rising from chimneys as people prepared breakfast. The ground was still wet from yesterday's storm, and Mason's eyes scanned desperately for footprints. "There," Clara pointed. A set of barefoot prints led from the barn toward their cabin. They followed the tracks to their home, bursting through the door with a cacophony of creaking hinges and pounding hearts. Inside, they stopped short at the sight before them. Willow stood in the center of their small living room, turning slowly, taking in every detail. She ran her fingers over the back of a chair, touched the wooden table, examined the flickering embers in the fireplace. When she heard them enter, she whirled around, instantly alert and wary. "It's okay," Clara said softly, holding up her hands to show she meant no harm. "This is your home, Willow." Willow's eyes darted between them and the door, clearly calculating whether she needed to escape. But then her gaze caught on something across the room, and she moved toward it with careful steps. It was a shelf with a row of wooden carvings, Mason's handiwork over the years: birds, deer, rabbits, and in the center a small bear. Willow reached out and gently touched the bear carving, then pulled the wooden bird from inside her animal skin clothing. She held them side by side, comparing. "I made those," Mason said quietly. "After you disappeared, I couldn't stop carving. It helped me feel close to you somehow." Willow turned to look at him, her head tilted in that peculiar way that reminded them both of the mother bear. She set the wooden bird down beside the bear carving and made a series of soft sounds. "She's trying to tell us something," Clara whispered. Mason nodded, but before he could respond, a loud commotion erupted outside. Shouts and angry voices carried through the open door. Willow tensed immediately, her posture changing from curious to defensive in an instant. "Stay here," Mason told her, though he knew she couldn't fully understand. He made calming gestures with his hands. "Clara, stay with her. I'll see what's happening." He hurried outside to find a crowd gathering near the barn. Sheriff Fletcher stood at the door, his arms spread wide to block several men from entering. Among them was Silas Mercer, his face flushed with anger. "Those are dangerous wild animals, Tom," Silas was shouting. "They don't belong in our village." "Step back, Silas," the sheriff warned. "You've done enough damage already." Mason rushed over. "What's going on?" Sheriff Fletcher glanced at him grimly. "Silas here has convinced some of the others that the bears are a threat. They want to finish what he started yesterday." "You can't be serious," Mason said, looking at the grim-faced men behind Silas. Some held rifles, others pitchforks and axes. "That bear protected my daughter for 15 years. She brought Willow back to us." "It's still a wild animal," one of the men, Harold Finch, said. "What happens when it recovers? What if it attacks our children?" "It hasn't attacked anyone yet," Mason argued, stepping in front of the barn door alongside the sheriff. "And Eleanor says it needs time to heal." "Where is the girl?" Silas demanded. "Did she run back to the woods already?" "She's at our house," Mason replied, not liking the glint in Silas's eye. "With Clara." "And the other bears? The younger ones?" "Inside, with their mother," Sheriff Fletcher answered, his hand moving subtly toward his holstered gun. "And they're staying there until I say otherwise." The standoff might have escalated further, but at that moment Eleanor Wright arrived, medical bag in hand. She took in the scene with one sharp glance, then marched directly up to Silas. "Move aside," she commanded. "I have a patient to check on." "Patient?" Silas scoffed. "It's a bear, Eleanor." "I don't recall asking for your medical opinion, Silas," she replied coolly. "Now, step aside, or I'll have Tom here arrest you for obstruction." Silas hesitated, glancing at the sheriff, who nodded in confirmation. With a muttered curse, Silas stepped back, though the look in his eyes made it clear this wasn't over. Eleanor and Mason entered the barn together, closing the door firmly behind them. The two younger bears rose immediately, huffing warnings, but Eleanor showed no fear. "They're remarkably restrained," she commented as she knelt beside the mother bear to check her wound. "Most bears would have attacked by now, especially with their mother injured." "Willow must have taught them somehow," Mason suggested, keeping a respectful distance. Or maybe they understand we're trying to help. Eleanor removed the bandages carefully. The wound looks better than I expected. No signs of infection yet. She began cleaning it again with fresh supplies from her bag. Where is Willow? At the house with Clara. She was exploring, looking at my carvings. Eleanor nodded thoughtfully as she worked. That's a good sign. She's curious about her past, about you and Clara. She paused, meeting his eyes. Mason, I need to tell you something. The way Willow moves, the sound she makes, she's been living with these bears for a very long time. Not just alongside them, but as one of them. What exactly are you saying? I'm saying that reintroducing her to human society will be incredibly difficult. She may never fully adapt. And these bears... Eleanor glanced at the younger ones, who watched her every move but made no threatening gestures. They're her family now. Separating them could be traumatic for all involved. Mason ran a hand through his hair, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. What are we supposed to do? We can't keep 3 bears in our barn forever, and Silas and his friends aren't going to just let this go. I don't have all the answers, Eleanor admitted, applying fresh bandages to the bear's wound. But I do know one thing. That girl out there is a miracle. She survived something no human child should have been able to survive. And those bears protected her when they could have just as easily killed her. There's something special happening here, Mason. Something none of us fully understand yet. A sudden commotion from outside interrupted their conversation. The door flew open, and Clara burst in, her face pale with panic. Mason, Eleanor, come quickly. What's happened? Mason demanded, already moving toward the door. Is it Willow? Clara nodded, gasping for breath. She collapsed. She's burning with fever. And there's something wrong with her arm, a wound I didn't notice before. Eleanor grabbed her medical bag immediately. Take me to her. As they hurried toward the cabin, Mason glanced back at the barn where the bears remained. The 2 younger ones were now making agitated sounds, as if they sensed something was wrong with Willow. The connection between them was unlike anything he had ever witnessed. Inside the cabin, they found Willow lying on the floor near the fireplace. Her skin was flushed, her breathing rapid and shallow. Eleanor knelt beside her, quickly examining her. Help me get her clothing off, she instructed. I need to find the wound Clara mentioned. Together, they carefully removed the animal skin wrappings that covered Willow's upper body, revealing skin marked with numerous old scars and fresh scratches from life in the wild. On her right arm, just below the shoulder, was an angry red gash, swollen and seeping. This is infected, Eleanor said grimly, probing the wound gently. Willow moaned, but didn't regain consciousness. It looks like a claw mark, maybe from another animal, and it's been festering for days. Can you help her? Clara asked, clutching Willow's limp hand. I'll do everything I can, Eleanor promised, already opening her medical bag. But we need to bring her fever down. Mason, I need cold water and clean cloths. Clara, help me get her onto the bed. As Mason fetched the requested items, a strange sound came from outside, a deep, mournful bellowing that raised the hair on the back of his neck. He looked out the window to see the 2 younger bears pacing anxiously outside the barn, making those eerie calling sounds. Somehow, they knew Willow was in danger. By the time he returned with the water and cloths, Eleanor and Clara had moved Willow to the small bedroom that had remained unchanged since she disappeared 15 years ago. The walls were still painted a soft green, and shelves lined with children's books and toys stood exactly as they had been on the day she vanished. It was a room frozen in time, waiting for a little girl who would never return in the form her parents had expected. Eleanor worked quickly, cleaning the infected wound and applying a poultice of herbs from her bag. "This will draw out the infection," she explained as she wrapped Willow's arm with clean bandages. "But she needs medicine, real medicine, the kind we don't have in Pinewood." "Then we'll go to Riverdale," Mason said decisively, naming the larger town 30 miles away. "They have a proper hospital there." "It's too dangerous to move her right now," Eleanor cautioned. "Her fever is too high, and the journey could kill her. We need to stabilize her first." Clara was bathing Willow's face with cool water, her own face etched with fear. "I can't lose her again," she whispered. "Not when we've just found her." Outside, the bellowing of the bears grew louder, more insistent. People were shouting now, too, angry, frightened voices carrying on the morning air. "Mason," Eleanor said quietly, "those bears are getting agitated. If they break out of the barn—" He nodded grimly. "I'll handle it." At the door, he paused, looking back at his daughter lying pale and still on the bed. "Take care of her," he said, his voice breaking slightly. Outside, the situation had deteriorated. The two younger bears were now circling the barn, huffing and growling. They'd pushed open the door but hadn't strayed far from their mother, who remained inside. A larger crowd had gathered, and Silas Mercer stood at the front, rifle in hand. "See?" he was saying to the crowd. "They're wild animals. They can't be contained. Put the gun down, Silas," Mason called out as he approached. "They're just worried about Willow." "Worried?" Silas scoffed. "They're bears, Mason. They don't worry. They attack." Sheriff Fletcher had arrived as well, positioning himself between Silas and the bears. "No one is shooting anything today," he said firmly. "These animals haven't hurt anyone." "Yet," Silas muttered, but he lowered his rifle slightly. Mason approached the bears cautiously, his hands held out in what he hoped was a non-threatening gesture. "They know something's wrong with Willow," he said to the sheriff. "That's why they're agitated." As if to confirm his words, one of the younger bears, slightly smaller than the other, perhaps female, rose onto her hind legs and bellowed again, her dark eyes fixed on Mason. There was something in that gaze that stopped him in his tracks, an intelligence, a questioning, almost human in its intensity. An idea struck him suddenly. "Wait here," he told the sheriff, "and keep Silas and his friends back." Mason hurried to the cabin, returning moments later with the wooden bird he had carved for Willow years ago, the one she had kept all this time. He held it up so the bears could see it. "Willow," he said clearly, pointing toward the cabin. "Willow is sick." The female bear dropped back to all fours, sniffing the air. She made a series of huffing sounds to her sibling, who responded with a low growl. Then, to everyone's astonishment, she began to move toward Mason. "Mason," Sheriff Fletcher warned, his hand moving to his gun. "It's okay," Mason said, though his heart was pounding. I think she understands." The bear stopped a few feet from Mason, rose onto her hind legs again, and sniffed the wooden bird in his hand. Then she dropped down and turned, loping toward the edge of the forest. "Where's it going?" someone in the crowd asked. "I don't know," Mason admitted, "but I think she's trying to help." The other young bear remained near the barn, standing guard over his injured mother. Mason approached him slowly, still holding the wooden bird. "We're trying to help Willow," he said, knowing it was absurd to talk to a bear, but feeling compelled to try. "She's very sick." To his amazement, the bear made a soft, chuffing sound and backed away slightly, allowing Mason to enter the barn. Inside, the mother bear lay where they had left her, but her eyes were open now, watching Mason with that same eerie intelligence he had seen in her offspring. "Your child saved mine," Mason said quietly, kneeling a safe distance from the massive creature. Now mine is in danger. She has a fever, an infection. The mother bear made a low, rumbling sound deep in her throat. Then, with obvious effort, she shifted her massive body and used her paw to push something toward Mason. A clump of what looked like moss and roots. Hesitantly, Mason reached for it. The moss was damp and had a strong, bitter smell. Beneath it were small white roots, gnarled and twisted. Understanding dawned on him. "Medicine," he breathed. "You're giving me medicine for Willow." The bear huffed once, as if in confirmation, then laid her head back down, clearly exhausted by the effort. Mason ran back to the cabin, the strange plant bundle clutched in his hand. Inside, Willow's condition had worsened. Her skin burned with fever, and she tossed restlessly on the bed, making distressed sounds that were neither human nor animal. "Eleanor," Mason gasped, holding out the plants. "The mother bear gave me this. I think it's medicine for Willow." Eleanor took the bundle skeptically. "Mason, we can't just give her unknown plants. It could poison her." "The bear was trying to help," Mason insisted. "She pushed it toward me specifically when I showed her the wooden bird and told her Willow was sick." Eleanor's expression was doubtful, but she examined the plants carefully. After a moment, her eyes widened in recognition. "This is feverfew," she said, indicating the white flowers mixed with the moss. "And this root, I think it's echinacea. Both are medicinal herbs. The moss could be a poultice for drawing out infection." She looked up at Mason in amazement. "These are real medicines, Mason. Plants that human healers have used for centuries. Can you use them to help Willow?" Eleanor nodded slowly. Yes, I can make a tea from the feverfew for her fever, and a stronger poultice from the echinacea and moss." She began working immediately, sending Clara to heat water. Mason sat beside Willow, taking her hot hand in his. How could the bear know about medicinal herbs? He wondered aloud. "Animals often seek out specific plants when they're ill," Eleanor replied as she prepared the treatments. "It's instinct, but to deliberately share that knowledge—" She shook her head in wonder. "It's remarkable." A commotion outside drew Mason's attention. He went to the window and saw the female bear returning from the forest. In her mouth, she carried more plants. Different ones this time, with purple flowers and long stems. Sheriff Fletcher and several villagers watched in astonishment as the bear deposited the plants on the ground near the cabin, then backed away, as if offering them to the humans. "What in God's name is happening in this village?" Mason heard someone mutter. Indeed, what was happening defied explanation. Bears that understood human speech, that gathered medicinal herbs, that had raised a human child as their own. It went against everything the people of Pinewood had ever believed about the natural world. Mason went outside to collect the new plants. As he approached, the female bear watched him intently but made no threatening moves. He picked up the bundle carefully. "Thank you," he said, feeling both foolish and profoundly grateful. "We'll use these to help her." The bear huffed once, then turned and loped back to the barn to rejoin her brother and mother. When Mason brought the new plants to Eleanor, she identified them immediately. "Echinacea," she confirmed. "And some other herbs I recognize. They're all medicinal, all useful for fighting infection." With Clara's help, Eleanor prepared treatments from both sets of plants. A tea for Willow to drink, and a poultice for her infected wound. They managed to coax a few sips of the bitter tea into Willow's mouth, and she swallowed reflexively, though she remained unconscious. "Now we wait," Eleanor said, applying the fresh poultice to Willow's arm. "And pray." The day passed in anxious vigilance. Mason split his time between sitting with Willow and checking on the bears, who remained remarkably calm now that they had provided the medicinal plants. Silas and his supporters kept a wary distance, though their resentment was palpable. As evening approached, Willow's fever finally broke. Her breathing eased, and the angry red swelling around her wound began to subside. Clara wept with relief when Willow's eyes fluttered open briefly, though she soon slipped back into a more natural sleep. "The medicine is working," Eleanor said, amazed. "Those plants the bears brought, they're more potent than anything in my medical bag." "So she'll recover?" Mason asked anxiously. Eleanor nodded. "I believe so. But Mason, Clara, we need to talk about what happens next. Willow can't stay in Pinewood, not with those bears. Silas and the others won't accept them here." "We can't separate her from them," Clara protested. "You've seen the connection they share." "And we can't leave," Mason added. "This is our home. Where would we go?" Eleanor sighed heavily. "I don't have all the answers, but I do know that what's happening here is extraordinary. Those bears aren't just animals, they're intelligent, caring beings. They saved Willow's life twice now, once when they took her in, and again today with their medicine." Outside, darkness fell over Pinewood. Inside the small cabin, 3 people sat vigil over a sleeping young woman who straddled 2 worlds. Not quite human anymore, but something more complex. A bridge between species that shouldn't have been possible. And in the old barn nearby, 3 bears rested, their heightened senses alert to any danger that might threaten their human family member. The mother bear's wound was healing, strengthened by the same herbs she had provided for Willow. The bond between them transcended the natural order in ways that challenged everything the village had ever believed. But as the first stars appeared in the evening sky, new eyes watched the village from the deep shadows of the whispering woods. Eyes that gleamed with malice and hunger. For the forest held other predators besides bears. Predators that had waited 15 years for the chance to finish what they had started on the day a small child vanished into the wilderness. The stranger crouched in the underbrush, observing the village with calculated patience. The rumors that had drawn him here seemed impossible. A wild girl raised by bears, returned after 15 years. But he had seen the bears with his own eyes now, seen the cabin where the girl supposedly recovered from her illness. His hand moved to the long scar that ran from his temple to his jaw, a scar left by the claws of a mother bear long ago, when he had tried to take what was not his to claim. He had survived, unlike his brothers, survived to plot his revenge against the bears that had ruined him. And now, after all these years, fate had delivered them right into his hands. The hunter smiled coldly in the darkness. Soon, very soon, the bears would pay, and the wild girl with them. Dawn light filtered through the small bedroom window, casting a golden glow over Willow's sleeping form. Clara sat beside the bed, having maintained her vigil throughout the night. She had barely slept since Willow's return, afraid that if she closed her eyes, her daughter would vanish again. There was movement on the bed. Willow's eyes opened, clear and alert for the first time since her collapse. She blinked slowly, taking in her surroundings with cautious curiosity. When she saw Clara, something flickered in her expression. Not quite recognition, but not fear either. "Good morning, Willow," Clara said softly. "How are you feeling?" Willow pushed herself up on her elbows, wincing slightly at the pain in her wounded arm. She looked down at the bandages, touched them gently, then made a series of soft, questioning sounds. "You were very sick," Clara explained, miming a fever and pointing to the arm. "The bears brought medicine. They helped you." At the mention of the bears, Willow became instantly alert. She looked around the small room, as if expecting to see them, then made urgent huffing sounds. "They're still in the barn," Clara assured her, pantomiming the location. "They're safe." Willow seemed to understand. She relaxed slightly, though her eyes continued to dart around the unfamiliar room, taking in the shelves of toys and books, the small bed with its faded quilt, the rocking chair in the corner where Clara had spent countless nights after Willow's disappearance, unable to sleep in her own bed. "This was your room," Clara said, her voice catching. "Before you were lost. This was where you slept." Willow tilted her head, that bear-like gesture that still startled Clara with its strangeness. She reached out and touched the quilt, ran her fingers over the stitching, then looked back at Clara with questioning eyes. "Would you like to see the rest of the house?" Clara asked, standing and gesturing toward the door. After a moment's hesitation, Willow nodded. She swung her legs over the edge of the bed and stood, swaying slightly. Clara reached out to steady her, and for a brief moment her hand touched Willow's bare arm. The first real physical contact between mother and daughter in 15 years. Willow stiffened but didn't pull away. Progress, Clara thought. Small but precious progress. Together they moved through the cabin, Clara explaining each room with simple words and gestures. Willow seemed particularly fascinated by the kitchen, with its iron stove and hanging pots and pans. She sniffed curiously at a loaf of bread Mason had brought from the village baker, then looked questioningly at Clara. "Food," Clara said, breaking off a small piece. "You eat it." Willow took the bread cautiously, sniffed it again, then nibbled a tiny bite. Her eyes widened in surprise, and she quickly ate the rest, making appreciative sounds. Clara smiled, her heart lighter than it had been in years. "There's more," she promised, cutting another slice. "You can have as much as you want." As Willow ate, Mason entered the cabin, his face brightening when he saw her up and about. "She's better," he said, relief evident in his voice. Clara nodded. "The fever's gone, and she's eating." Willow watched their interaction with keen interest, her eyes moving between them as they spoke. Then she made a series of sounds, clearly trying to communicate something important. "The bears," Mason guessed. "You want to see them?" Willow nodded emphatically. "I'll take you to them," he promised. "But first, I need to tell you what's happening in the village." He explained to Clara that tension was growing. More villagers had sided with Silas Mercer overnight, convinced that the bears posed a danger that couldn't be ignored. Sheriff Fletcher was doing his best to maintain order, but the situation was becoming volatile. "We need to think about leaving," Mason said quietly, though not quietly enough. Willow's head snapped up at his tone, instantly alert to the undercurrent of danger in his voice. She made a low, warning sound remarkably similar to her bear family's growls. "It's okay," Clara soothed. "We won't let anything happen to you or the bears." But Willow was already moving toward the door, her intention clear. She needed to see her bear family now. Mason sighed, exchanging a worried glance with Clara. "All right, but stay close to us." Outside, the village was fully awake, and all eyes turned to watch as Willow emerged from the cabin, flanked by her parents. Word of her recovery had spread overnight, adding to the already feverish rumors swirling through Pinewood. The bears sensed her approach before she reached the barn. Excited huffing and chuffing sounds emanated from within, and when Mason opened the door, the two younger bears rushed out to greet Willow. There were gasps and cries of alarm from watching villagers, but Willow dropped to her knees and the bears surrounded her, sniffing her healed wound and making sounds that could only be described as joyful. She responded in kind, communicating with them in their own language of grunts and huffs. Inside the barn, the mother bear was trying to rise, clearly eager to see Willow too. Mason hurried to help, supporting the massive animal as she struggled to her feet. Her wound was healing remarkably well, but she was still weak from blood loss. Once standing, the mother bear moved slowly out into the daylight, where Willow waited. Their reunion brought tears to Clara's eyes. Willow pressed her forehead against the bear's broad one, her hands tangled in the thick fur, making soft, soothing sounds. The mother bear responded with gentle huffs, nudging Willow with her massive snout, checking her scent, assuring herself that her human child was indeed recovering. It was a moment of pure connection, beautiful and strange and somehow sacred, which made what happened next all the more shocking. A rifle shot cracked through the morning air. The mother bear roared in pain as a bullet grazed her shoulder, reopening her barely healed wound. The two younger bears spun toward the source of the threat, hackles raised, teeth bared. Willow screamed, a sound so human, so filled with anguish and rage, that it froze everyone in place for a crucial moment. Then chaos erupted. Silas Mercer stood at the edge of the crowd, rifle raised for a second shot. But before he could fire again, Sheriff Fletcher tackled him to the ground, sending the bullet wild into the air. "Have you lost your mind?" the sheriff shouted, wresting the rifle away from Silas. But it was too late. The damage was done. The younger bears, seeing their mother wounded again, charged toward the crowd. People scattered, screaming in terror. Willow tried to call the bears back, making frantic sounds, but their protective instincts had taken over. In the midst of the pandemonium, a new figure appeared, moving with deliberate purpose toward the Reed cabin. No one noticed him in the chaos. No one except Mason, who caught a glimpse of a scarred face and cold, calculating eyes. "Clara!" he shouted. "Get inside!" But Clara was focused on Willow, who was desperately trying to calm the bears, placing herself between them and the fleeing villagers. The mother bear was bleeding again, moaning in pain. The younger bears were beyond reason, driven by an instinct to protect that overrode even their bond with Willow. The stranger moved unnoticed through the confusion, circling behind the barn. Mason tried to reach Clara and Willow, but the panicked crowd separated them, pushing him in the opposite direction. He caught another glimpse of the scarred man, now carrying something in his hands, something that glinted in the morning light. "Sheriff!" Mason shouted. "There's someone!" His warning was cut short by a new sound, a deep, resonant bellowing that somehow carried over the chaos. It came from the mother bear, who had managed to stand tall despite her wound. The sound she made was unlike anything the villagers had ever heard. Not a roar of aggression, but a call, a summons that echoed through the trees. The younger bears froze, turning toward their mother. She called again, and reluctantly they backed away from the terrified villagers, returning to her side. Willow joined them, her hands moving soothingly over the mother bear's bloody fur. In the sudden quiet that followed, Sheriff Fletcher hauled Silas to his feet. "You're under arrest," he said grimly, "for reckless endangerment and attempted murder." "Murder?" Silas protested. "It's a bear." "It's under my protection," the sheriff replied firmly, "as is the girl and her family." The scarred stranger had disappeared back into the shadows, unnoticed by all but Mason. But he had seen enough. The bears were dangerous, yes, but not in the way he had expected. Their intelligence, their connection with the wild girl, the way they responded to commands, it was unlike anything he had encountered in all his years as a hunter. This would require a different approach. As the crowd dispersed and Sheriff Fletcher led Silas away, Eleanor rushed to tend to the mother bear's new wound. "This needs to stop," she told Mason and Clara fiercely. "These bears cannot stay in the village. It's too dangerous. for them and for everyone else. Then what do we do? Clara asked desperately. We can't separate Willow from them. You've seen how they are together. Eleanor looked thoughtful as she applied fresh bandages to the bear's shoulder. There might be another way, she said slowly. My brother owns land near the mountains, about 50 miles from here. It's remote, isolated. There's an old homestead there that no one uses anymore. Mason caught her meaning immediately. Somewhere the bears could live safely, and Willow could stay with them without danger from people like Silas. Eleanor nodded. It would mean leaving Pinewood, she warned, starting over somewhere new. Clara and Mason exchanged a long look. They had lived in Pinewood their entire lives. It was home, with all the comfort and familiarity that word implied. But home was also where their daughter was, where she felt safe and loved. If we stayed here, Clara said softly, something terrible would happen eventually. Silas isn't the only one who fears what he doesn't understand. Mason nodded slowly. How soon could we leave? I can send a message to my brother today, Eleanor replied, but the mother bear needs at least another day or two to recover enough for the journey. Willow had been watching them intently, trying to follow the conversation despite not understanding the words. But she seemed to grasp that important decisions were being made. She made a series of questioning sounds, looking from her human parents to the bears, and we're going to find a new home, Clara told her, using gestures to help convey the meaning. For all of us, you, me, your father, and your bear family. Willow's eyes widened. She pointed to the bears, then to herself, then to Clara and Mason, making a circular motion with her finger that somehow perfectly expressed the concept of together. Yes, Mason confirmed. Together. For the first time since her return, Willow smiled, a small, hesitant curve of her lips that transformed her wild features into something achingly human. Clara's heart swelled at the sight. It was a beginning. A fragile, tenuous bridge between Willow's two worlds. But as the sun climbed higher in the sky, casting long shadows behind the cabin, none of them noticed the figure watching from the edge of the forest. The scarred hunter had heard every word, understood every plan. And he was already thinking several steps ahead, plotting a trap that would finally give him the revenge he had waited 15 years to exact. His hand moved to the strange metal cylinder he carried. A tranquilizer gun, powerful enough to bring down even the largest bear. But it wasn't the bears he planned to target first. No, the key to everything was the wild girl. Capture her, and the bears would follow. And then, when they were all within his grasp, he would finally finish what had been started that day by the river, when 3 brothers had found a lost child and seen an opportunity for profit. 2 of those brothers had died beneath the mother bear's claws and teeth. But he, Ezra Blackwood, had survived. Survived and waited and planned. And now, at last, the time for revenge had come. In the barn, Willow suddenly stiffened, her head tilting in that animal-like way as she sniffed the air. Her eyes narrowed as she gazed toward the forest edge, sensing something, or someone, watching from the shadows. The mother bear noticed her tension and made a soft, questioning sound. Willow turned back to her strange, blended family, the bears who had raised her and the humans who had given her life. She looked from the mother bear's wounded shoulder to Clara's hopeful eyes, understanding in that moment that 2 worlds were colliding because of her. And somewhere in the forest, a new danger was lurking, waiting to destroy everything she loved. As the sun rose higher in the sky, casting its golden light over the village of Pinewood, Willow made a silent promise to both her families. Whatever was coming, Whatever threats awaited them, she would protect them, just as they had protected her. The journey ahead would be difficult, the path uncertain, but they would face it together. The wooden bird remained clutched in her hand, a bridge between her past and her future, between the human world and the wilderness that had claimed her. With one last glance toward the forest where she sensed hidden eyes watching, Willow turned back to the barn, determined to prepare for whatever came next.